Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the Climate Action Tracker's press conference. The Climate Action Tracker has been tracking government action for the past decade. Today, we are releasing the latest of our global updates, which takes into account the announcements made at last week's World Leaders Summit. My name is Claire Stockwell. I have double duties today, both as your moderator and one of our speakers. I'm a senior climate policy analyst with Climate Analytics, one of the two organizations behind the Climate Action Tracker. I am joined by Climate Analytics CEO Bill Hare, who will be joining, you'll see in a moment, on our screens virtually from Australia. To my right is Nicholas Herna, the founding partner of the New Climate Institute, which is the other organization behind the Climate Action Tracker. And to my left is Maria Jose de Villafranca, a climate policy analyst also with the New Climate Institute. Each of us will make some opening remarks, and then I will open the floor for your questions. So with that, let's begin. 6 years ago in Paris, governments agreed to come to this climate conference with updated NDCs, because even at the time of Paris, we knew that the targets that were on the table were insufficient to meet the temperature limit of 1.5 degrees. Our immediate task to keep that temperature limit within reach is clear, and that's halving emissions from today's levels by 2030. Now, while the majority of countries have come to this meeting with updated targets, those targets we find have only reduced the emissions gap by about 15 to 17%. And there's a great diversity within these updates that countries have submitted. Some have clearly strengthened their targets, like South Africa and Morocco, whose targets are close to being 1.5 degree compatible under our rating system. Others are a little bit harder to assess, like India, which announced its update last week at the World Leaders Summit. Our assessment is that that would at most reduce its emissions a little bit below what we project is that they will reach in 2030 under current policies. And still others have submitted updates with nothing new in them, like Australia, or even worse, have submitted a less ambitious target than the first target that they put forward, which seems to be the case with Brazil. So one thing is clear, all governments need to reconsider their targets so that we can keep 1.5 degrees alive. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill to walk you through our temperature estimates. Bill?
Thank you, Claire, and welcome to our Climate Action Tracker press conference, everyone. The Climate Action Tracker has really prepared a fairly monumental analysis for these final days of Glasgow, and we found that there's a massive credibility, action and commitment gap with the warming that countries' current pledges for 2030 are taking us towards of 2.4 degrees. As Claire said, the whole point of Glasgow is that it's the first real test of whether or not the Paris Agreement's ratchet up mechanism will actually work. That's why countries were invited to bring back to this COP updated and enhanced nationally determined contributions for 2030. There's nearly a 1 degree gap between where countries' current policies are headed towards 2.7 degrees warming and the net zero announcements that governments have made recently. Since the April 2021 Biden Leaders Summit, we have calculated some improvement in where the government's pledges and so on are headed, principally through the inclusion of the net zero targets of the US and China. Now, while we found, along with others, that the projected warming from all net zero announcements, if fully implemented, would bring warming down to 1.8 degrees, and overall a peak 21st century warming of 1.9 degrees, this is far from positive news given the poor quality of most of the net zero goals and the absolutely massive ambition and action gap in 2030. The vast majority of 2030 actions, in fact, and targets are not consistent with the net zero goals put forward by government. Glasgow is meant to keep the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree limit in sight, but the 2030 emissions gap is still so huge that we can't really see that being possible at present. It's all very well for leaders and governments to claim that they have a net zero target, but if they don't have plans as to how to get there, and their 2030 targets are not aligned with net zero, then frankly, these net zero targets are just paying lip service to real climate action. That's the key reason we think that Glasgow at this stage has a very big credibility gap.
Okay, thank you, Bill. My name is Niklas Höhne, also welcome from my side. I will continue say a little bit about the net zero targets because that was one of the main themes of this COP. And we now have more than 140 governments announcing net zero targets. They cover more than 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And at first sight, that's positive news. If we then assume that all of these countries indeed meet their net zero targets that they have put forward, then we calculate a temperature increase by the end of the century of 1.8 degrees. That's again 0.2 degrees better than in May. So that is the most optimistic outlook, and that's why we call it the optimistic scenario. But it's unfortunately not the likely scenario. It's not time to sit back and relax. We have not done it yet because not a single country has short-term policies in place to put itself on track towards its own net zero target. Right now, the net zero targets are a good vision, imagination, but they have to be backed by action, by short-term action. Otherwise, they are simply not credible. And that's where the big problem is. And that's where also this COP has only moved a small step forward. We heard it already. The gap has decreased through this update process only up to 15 to 17%. So we are still having a huge gap. Assuming all countries implement everything they have proposed here, we would in 2030 still emit twice as much as we should if we want to be on a 1.5 trajectory. Just repeat, with everything that countries put on the table, all their new pledges that also come here, we will still emit roughly twice as much as we should in 2030 if we want to be on a 1.5 pathway. And that really shows the magnitude of the problem. All countries have to go back, not only those that just submitted the same thing as 5 years ago. All countries have to go back and rethink what they can do And the only way to do that is basically go into emergency mode. If we just go baby steps each time, it doesn't work. Governments have to do something substantially different. And part of that emergency mode could be to come back each year, so next year already, not to wait 5 years for the next update round. Then we may have lost 1.5 degrees. We can only save it if countries acknowledge this large gap and come back next year and next year and next year with even more ambitious short-term actions, not only long-term promises. Over to you, Maria.
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you. My name is Maria Jose Villafranca, also with New Climate Institute. Well, we all heard a lot about targets, but the Climate Action Tracker also looks at what's actually down there, the policies that countries have put forward. Our assessment shows that there's a little bit of improvement since our previous one, so 0.2 degrees better. Now we're standing at 2.7 degrees. But that's also not a positive thing. It's going way too slow, and we found out that this is not because of major policies being brought forward, but mostly because of changes in inventories, updates in emissions, in economic growth, etc. So we've seen that there's a lot of countries that still rely a lot on coal and gas, and these are two things that have to be dealt with within the next decade if we are to be on track for 1.5. But not everything is bad news. We've seen countries like Chile, South Korea, Thailand that in their energy sectors they already plan to reduce coal. Chile in particular, we've seen that they have even done it faster than they originally planned. And on top of that, they've also looked into additional policies like the energy efficiency one. However, these countries that are planning to move away from coal should be very, very careful not to get themselves into locking emissions by switching to another fossil fuel gas. And instead, focus on changing this to renewable energy, which is cheaper than fossil fuel. Other thing that we've heard here at the conference is all the initiatives. We've had a quick assessment on that and the sector emissions, sector initiatives, and we found that while it is really good that countries are part of these initiatives, that a lot of the potential that are within those initiatives are already covered by their pledges and by their policies. So we should also be careful there. And well, the main, the last message is we go from having really good outlook at the most optimistic scenario that Nicholas presented. We have the pledges and targets scenario, but the one that is at the highest, so with the highest temperature, is the one with the policies, and that's where we're currently headed. So besides the targets, countries should really put at home sufficient policies to back all their plans and all their targets. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Maria. Okay, I will open the floor to questions. If you could just state your name and organization as well in the back there, sir. Yes.
Joydeep Gupta from the Third Pole and the Climate Change Media Partnership. So yesterday we had this investigative article in the Washington Post which showed that many countries are underreporting their emissions, and you are taking those emissions that the countries are reporting at face value. So if those countries are underreporting their emissions, what is the value of all your calculations?
Thanks for that question. I think the issue of calculating how much emissions countries have is a long-standing issue. There's ups and downs. There's certain uncertainties there. There has been this report that there has significantly under-reporting. What we are doing is we are actually not taking the country's emissions as face value. We always complement them with all other estimates that are out there, and we decide, well, make an expert judgment which numbers we trust most. And that's quite a lot of work, and that's very unfortunate. We don't have a very good database for all of this, and I think the community could probably do better. But what we do is we curate the data and we use the best we can get. Well, that is not error-free, but is as good as we can get. So I would think what we are doing is quite reliable on what you have. We test whether the total emissions that we get are consistent with all other estimates that are out there.
Thank you. Next question, and you'll have to help me. The lights are strong up here, so if I'm missing hands, please wave them vigorously. No? Oh, in the front?
Microphone, wait a second.
Yes.
Jayashri from the Hindustan Times. I wanted to know, right now we are on track for 2.7 degree warming, if you don't consider the net zero targets. Is that what you said? If you could just clarify on that.
I'll start off and then anyone else can join. The 2.7 estimate is for our current policies. So that's basically the actions that are on the ground in countries at the moment. So obviously that's the highest level of estimate. And then if you say, okay, well, what happens if they take the targets that they've currently put on the table? That then gets us to 2.4 degrees. And then if you add in addition to just that's the 2030 targets, if you then add in targets, the long-term targets that we consider to be binding, so those are either the net zero targets that have been passed in domestic law or that have been submitted to the UNFCCC in enough detail in the long-term strategies that countries are submitting, that gets us to 2.1. And then if you broaden the scope and consider all of the net zero targets, also beyond countries that the CAT only normally tracks about 40 countries globally that represent around 80% of emissions. But if you broaden that scope and look at all countries that have announced in some way or that are considering and discussing net zero targets, then that's when you get to the best estimate, which is the 1.8. So. Next question. Yes, the woman in the back.
Hi, I'm a graduate student from the Yale School of the Environment and also working at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. I was just wondering, in what way do you account for business actors within the emissions that you talked about? Because when you're looking at net zero for political policies, it is obviously just political policy. So how do you consider industry action within your sort of modeling framework?
Yeah, Nicholas.
Yeah, thanks. So what we are really doing is looking at government policies that are in there. And the whole idea is that, well, there's an ambition loop between business actions, cities, regions actions, and national actions. So if the businesses are more ambitious or the cities are more ambitious, that at one point governments are equally more ambitious and then they help each other to do more. We have, in a different project, we have estimated the impact of businesses as well. It's a little bit in addition, so it wouldn't change the picture significantly if you would take all of their actions into account as well. But you have a point here. The gap is so huge, it cannot be solved by government action alone. You need this ambition loop between all of these different actors. That is very positive, but again, be careful. There's a lot of announcements, and also there, not all announcements are really implemented, and that's why you need to be careful on those actors as well.
Great. Next question. Anyone? Oh, in the back.
Thank you very much. Andy Wiltshire from the Met Office. My question is, come 2030, how big is the emissions gap given your latest assessments?
In megatons, the emissions gap would be 45 to 49 gigatons. Whereas if you wanted to follow the median estimate for a 1.5 degree pathway, it would be 26 gigatons. So that gives you a gap of 19 to 23. So yes. All right. If there are no other questions, then maybe, oh, yes, Masako, please.
Thank you. Masako Konishi, WWF Japan. I wanted to ask that UNEP gap report, I heard that they are doing 66% probability. And this one, from what I heard, is 50-50. So when you do the same probability analytics, do you come to the kind of a similar conclusion? All three research organizations is doing this, and I was wondering how it is consistent.
It's a great question.
Exactly. So there's different ways to say what temperature level we reach. We always use a 50-50 chance of reaching a certain temperature level. Others, like the UNEP emissions gap report, uses a 66% chance to be below a certain level, and that's usually a higher level then. If you compare like with like, we are very, very close by a matter of 0.1 degree. If you compare the right scenarios with each other. So it's, well, it's also no coincidence because the Climate Action Tracker is one of the main inputs to the UNEP emissions gap report. That gap report actually is updated as we speak. Right now there's another event, and they come up with exactly very, very similar temperature estimates. Also, I can say there has been this estimate of the IEA for all the net zero targets. They also use a 50-50 chance. So if you compare them as well on the right basis, you get the same thing. So if you want to be, our estimates that you see here are always on a 50-50 chance, and the 66th percentile numbers are a little bit higher, but they're totally consistent.
Thanks, Nicholas. And if you want further detail, in the briefing paper, which is available on our website in the 4th annex, we have a detailed listing that compares our assessment to the UNFCCC synthesis report and the UNEP gap so that you can see the temperatures there. So thanks very much. I think there was a question over here.
Yes, may I ask whether these results are coming from all countries or only the major emissions? Because in the Climate Action Tracker website, I don't see the results of the assessment of all countries, only certain countries. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may. So at the Climate Action Tracker, we follow in-depth analysis for 40 countries, but the global emissions take also emissions from the rest of the world. We just don't do them sort of bottom up, but we take scenarios for that.
And also estimate their NDCs of the countries that we are not covering in detail. So we also integrate the NDCs that all the other countries have put forward.
Yeah, correct.
Any other questions? If not, then I will give the panelists just a couple of moments to wrap up, and maybe starting with Bill, if you're ready.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Claire. Look, I guess one of the critical issues now, looking to the final days of the COP, is just how parties are going to increase the ambition. And it's quite clear that the emissions gap that's huge is not going to be closed in the next few days. So I think the focus needs to be in the last days of the COP on coming out of Glasgow with a very heavy and serious process for next year, where countries are invited very strongly to bring back sufficient action to really close this emission gap significantly. As my colleagues have said, the biggest issues out there now, in some ways, are the absence of serious action on the coal phase out that's needed, and also on gas. Gas is the fastest growing source of CO2 emissions the last 5 or 10 years. If you look at the International Energy Agency projections, it's one of the fastest growing sources over the next decade. So it's really incumbent now on countries to really address those challenges. And politically, we need this COP to agree a very time-bound process in 2022 to come back, possibly at leaders level next year, to really nail this 1.5 degree limit and to close the gap.
Great. Thanks very much, Bill. Maria?
Yes, thank you, Claire. Well, I would reiterate that besides all the really good intentions, putting the targets and the initiatives and the pledges, that countries must back them up at home and do policy that's necessary to achieve those targets.
Great. Nicholas?
Yeah, thanks. Just to reiterate, if with all the policies that are currently implemented, our temperature estimate is 2.7 degrees, and if we use the 66th percentile, it's only a 66% chance that we are below 2.9 degrees. So that is catastrophic climate change. It's a situation that we simply can't handle with the currently implemented policies. And there's a huge gap towards what countries put forward. And our low number of 1.8 degrees is nice to have, but currently we are really not on a pathway towards it. And this huge gap that we have in 2030 is so huge that it's not enough to do a little bit here and there. It's not enough to do a little a methane initiative or do some initiative on coal or some initiative on transport. All of these elements are good, but not enough. They move the needle a little bit lower, if at all. But what's really necessary is a complete different way of looking at it, and that all countries go back. I recommend you to look at the Climate Action Tracker website, because we have a lot of information there for you, for all of the 40 countries that we analyze, latest policy developments, how much they are doing, what they could do better. We have a very detailed analysis now on their net zero targets, whether they're of high quality or not, and what they could do better to define their net zero targets. That's new. We also look into climate finance, on how much climate finance they provide and whether that's fair and enough. So there's a lot to explore on climateactiontracker.org. Over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Nicholas. I was actually going to say that my colleagues have impressed enough upon you the sense of urgency, so I was going to remind people to visit the website, but Nicholas beat me to it. So yes, the briefing paper is now up, and all of the data associated with the emissions gap and the warming projections is available there. So I would encourage you, if you have any further questions or interest, to check out the website, and if you would like to contact us with other questions, just please send them to our press@climateactiontracker.org email. And that's great. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice day.
Yeah.